Well, welcome to this afternoon's session. We've done a huge amount of prep for this, and they're laughing already. There's a considerable amount of thought behind the points we're going to raise. Basically, we asked ourselves a number of key questions about this whole topic of articulating risk. I'm not sure we're all in agreement, which I hope will make for some interesting discussion. We've a few key slides to prompt us, founded on a series of bullet points contributed by most of the panel. The first is this, and it's talking about risk appetite. And the statement that we're going to talk about or debate is we need to define the level of risk that an organization is comfortable with. Forgive the ending in a preposition, it's kind of where we're at these days with marketing. So I'm going to ask Thom to start and just see what he's got to say about how practical it is and how we go about that defining the level of risk.
I think it's very unique to every single organisation, and I think it's very difficult. Most organisations wouldn't be able to tell you what their level of risk acceptance is or what their comfort with risk is at any point. They probably couldn't even tell you if it's a number or a colour or anything like that. But what I would suggest is Google is your friend here. There's plenty of different ways of measuring risk, and there's plenty of different ways of ascertaining where you might sit along that. ANISA online, they do some excellent tools. We use, for instance, the ISO 27005 model, and to be honest with you, we use a RAG status because it's one that we have worked very hard with our leadership to make sure they understand the concepts of what we're trying to put across and the universe in which they're operating. So they know that red is not necessarily bad and green is not necessarily good. It's just an indication, it's just an arbitrary indication of where you are along a sliding scale. So very much unique to your organisation, plenty of tools out there, and find one that works for you and you can communicate effectively with your leadership and that they understand fully in the same terms that you do.
James?
One thing that might come up across some of the other questions is I think there's quite a large gap between the way that risk management frameworks and risk scoring works in information security, and you might be trained CISMs, CISPs, and those kind of models. You've got the ISO model. The PCI standard suggests Octave and NIST as some of the other risk management frameworks that are very, very InfoSec orientated. But that might be very different in larger organizations to the enterprise-wide risk management. So you really need to, if you don't work for the risk director, and you work in IT or digital technology, if you don't work in the risk department, you need to build bridges and find out how risk is communicated. And in the larger organizations, say up to PLC or global, you're going to have risk committees and audit committees. And what they expect to be described as risks is going to be very different to how you respond to Patch Monday, Patch Tuesday, what is it? So accept there is a big difference between ERM and RMF, and then deal with it. That's what I would say.
Yeah, good stuff. I think we've got some more discussion around those points as well in a couple of slides' time. David?
So I would think from having just gone through this exercise, I would say that the key is defining the level of risk that the organization is comfortable with. We all have different product teams, different engineering teams, different smaller divisions within the organization that are perfectly willing to accept a lot of risk. So it's really a matter of looking at the overall profile of how all of that risk is rolling up and really defining on that organization level, because there's so many teams that want to get their products out and their different agendas addressed that really they're a lot more willing or a lot more risk tolerant than the organization as a whole, and looking at how that rolls up to the organization level to be able to get a good idea of are we on course or not.
Do you think there's a general preset, though, set by the risk appetite at the top of the organization? Does that influence a general approach to risk with the outliers that you'd expect in, say, marketing?
I think it's been, or we've gone that direction, but I think it's been more of a discussion of now seeing all the different divisional risks boil up, and then looking at from the top-down point of view of, is the organization really comfortable as a whole with that level of risk, and then really using that as a tuning mechanism, being, okay, we're not really comfortable with that. because we had no idea that certain divisions were willing to accept maybe such a high level of risk, or that risk was going to bleed over into another division.
Right.
So I think it is important to define the level of risk the organisation is comfortable with. I think what many organisations run into problems is they don't do anything to manage those risks while they're trying to work out what level of risk they're happy to accept. So they feel we must define something before we can actually work to reduce our risk to that level. Within our organisation now, we have a fairly mature risk management programme and a framework within John Lewis. What we don't really have yet is a defined level of risk that we're happy to accept, and we're trying to get that over to the business to say that isn't the point that should stop us doing any risk management activity. We can define that later on. We can start working. We know what the high-level risks are, and we know we should be doing activities to reduce those risks. We can work to develop that sort of risk acceptance level, and then when we get to that point, we can put them to one side.
So that leads me into the second slide that we put together. I'm not going to tell you where the image came from, but those of you that know Gene Spafford will know he'll be chasing me for copyright on this. But anyway, there's this statement that it leads on from this top-down view of risk, that there shouldn't be such a thing as a cybersecurity risk per se, but rather there are just business risks that have IT or security-related causes. And just so we don't do this very boring rotational thing, I'm going to chuck that straight back at James.
Well, yeah, thank you very much. One thing I would say about that is if we link it into all the hype around the very well publicized vulnerabilities, they all had a name, they all had a logo, that became the big thing that allowed cyber threats to make it into mainstream media. It will have been in the, I was going to say it's going to be on the BBC website, and other news websites are available. But it made it into mainstream, which made it become a point for discussion high up in all sizes of organisations. People wanted to know what shell shock or heartbleed, to take two of them, meant to their organisation. Because so many places are internet connected, and because those were about your public-facing internet, it became talked about by non-techies, and non-techies high up in the organisation with responsibilities. Once you get to directors and C-suite, there's go-to-jail risks, and there's bankruptcy risks for getting it wrong. Yep. So cyber might be creeping onto their agenda, but to let them know it comes back again to what their appetite for doing business on the internet, the risks associated. Do they understand it? So the comment that we need to learn the language of business, which comes up every year in the risk discussions, is just as important to this, because we've got to learn how to articulate the severity of the impact around those sort of bugs and vulnerabilities, what it means to the organisation that a CEO can understand, or even a CFO if they're responsible for insurance and payout and legal. It's coming back to that learning the language of business.
Yeah, interesting. So is there a danger, and chuck this at David, is there a danger that if the board see cybersecurity risks in its own little category, that they won't know how to deal with it, or that they'll think that it's, in some sense, IT's problem, classically, and that it's not something that they can make decisions on?
I would tend to agree with that. It makes it harder to connect it to the business, whereas if you're taking something maybe higher level, we're in the cloud because we're advancing certain business objectives, maybe time to market, maybe things like that they'll understand that, and then you can distill, what are the high level risks associated with maybe being in the public cloud. But I think it does have to be tied to the business risk decision at the end of the day.
Yeah, I would completely agree with this statement. I think all of us as security practitioners in our teams, we're not special little flowers in our organisation who have our own set of rules. We actually are, just one part of the integrated functions that make up the business, like finance and legal and HR, etc. We should not think that our risks are special just because they're cyber or security or whatever. We need to actually put those across, the relevant ones across to the board in the same way that everybody else does. And that as a business risk that has an impact on the financial or the operational aspects of the business, whatever's important. It might be about saving money, might be about making more money, it might be about producing more widgets, whatever it is. But if those risks affect your business's primary and secondary goals of operation, they need to be put across in the same way as everyone else's.
And do you think, from your experience with your peers, that across the piece people really understand how to do that? And if not, how can they learn?
No, I don't think they do. And I think a number of reasons for that, I think, is that, and it is changing now, I think, certainly over the last sort of 3 or 4 years. But, a lot of security organizations or departments came out of IT, and IT was very much focused on blinky boxes and flashing lights and TLAs and DLP and all that sort of stuff, and couldn't talk it in other terms. And it took the CIOs a long time to start seeing themselves as actually enablers of the business, etc. And I think the CISOs of the world and the security organizations are behind the curve on this. And obviously we are getting better because we're even talking about it now. But we still see ourselves in that sort of special category, and it's not at all. And it means that we don't engage with the business, and it means we have panels that talk about how you can even talk to the business in the first place.
Yeah.
So picking up on that point there that Thom mentioned, so I won't claim to be ahead of the curve, but I think we're on the curve. So I think my function sits within IT nominally, but I'm a business-facing function. Very much it's not an IT side of thing. And I think I would agree with the statement here. It's all about the business risk and the impact. So from John Lewis' point of view, reputational risk is huge in our organization.
Yeah.
We have called out information security risks specifically within our corporate risk register, just more to give them the visibility to the board. And they see that as the number one risk within our organization. So that sits at the top of our corporate risk register. So they've called it out specifically just to focus people's attention on that. So to build the security function within John Lewis, which they've not had in the past, to have somebody dedicated and just focusing on that. So I would agree with the statement, but I think it is important to pull those risks out to have people have visibility. The other thing I would say is within the information security risks we identify and we're managing, we make sure those are embedded across all our divisions within the divisional risk registers. So their business risks, the information security risks underpin all of those business risks as well.
That's a really interesting point. So it sparked some thoughts in here for a project I was working on last month in my day job, and looking at a risk register for an organisation that really, it does security for a living, but I found my job was to review that risk register and to decide whether it was, in my view, fit for purpose. It didn't describe information at all. And it was primarily about availability, and instead of being threat-based, it was all about technological failure or unavailability of systems and things like that. It seemed to me that maybe there isn't even an accepted best practice way of putting a risk register together so that it incorporates all aspects of the business and what the business does for a living, rather than being driven by either technical people at one end of the scale or risk theorists at the other.
We've had real good success in that space as far as kind of, as you mentioned earlier, improving the information security team's essentially business acumen by, I've embedded each of my directs within our different business portfolio units where they attend the business-facing meetings so they can start getting the business depth they need to make sure that we're aligned with what's trying to be accomplished there. And I think that's starting to show positive results as we're going through the exercise of looking at the risk register and really building the risk from a business risk point of view.
Okay. So I think this leads nicely on to mapping the new or changed business activities onto the risks and then onto the mitigation strategy. And I forget which of you that presented this to me, but it's a goodie. And my favourite BYOD cartoon to support it. Mike, how do you feel about this process of looking at new and changing business activities. I mean, John Lewis has this massive revenue-generating website. It's innovating in that area a lot, and you must be deploying lots of interesting new technologies as well for mobile devices and so on. How do you function in terms of mapping that onto risks and then onto mitigation strategy?
It's a challenge. To be honest, battle is the wrong word. So we have an ongoing debate with what we call our customer experience team, who their view is innovative features, new ways of selling, getting the customer to buy a product. That's what they want to do. So when we ask them to introduce new features, or we point out risks with whatever it is they might be proposing, whether it's a new way of selling or they want to track the number of conversions for a particular new product, we really have to go right back to the basics and explain about why, we aren't going to lose customers taking 2 or 3 extra seconds to validate their credentials and map those risks there. And even then, when we put we try and explain what the mitigating actions could be, they're very much coming from the view, well, it's a lost customer. If it's an extra 2 seconds, the customer's going to go to a competitor's website. So we very much have that balance there. So I try and take the view, we're not trying to wrap the layers of security around this to make this, we're not a bank or a financial organization. We don't need that really, really high level of security, but at the same time, we're looking at what are our competitors doing. Are the Amazons, are the Marks and Spencer of this world doing similar things? Should we be following them? Should we be leading? And that's sort of the driver. And then talking to our customer experience team, saying, look, if you're losing 2% of your conversions because people are not wanting to put their passwords in, they're probably the 2% of your customers you don't want to be having anyway, because they may be the fraudulent customers.
Interesting point. So, Thom.
I was just a small point. Amazon are a great example of that, because they've accepted that risk. They have the buy it now button. You just press it and it's delivered to you the following day. They don't take any extra credit card details. They don't take the CVV. They don't confirm anything else. And they're willing to accept that risk because of the increased revenue that it brings. And so that's a great example of which side of the fence are you sitting on when it comes to it. There's not a right or wrong answer. I think it's just understanding what the risk is and being willing to accept it or not accept it.
But can we see this as, what I was listening to Mike, I'm thinking it's almost, I won't say circular, it's a back and forth discussion between the design team for a new feature, the risk specialist or security person saying, but these are the issues here that this new mechanism might introduce, and here's some alternative mitigation strategies. How does that affect your business plan? And it becomes I would hope, and you called it a debate, I think, rather than something more in the way of an argument. And I think that debate must be healthy, mustn't it? Because in conducting those debates, you're in effect teaching the people coming up with the business ideas more about how to think about the risks as well as the features and benefits. I don't know what you guys think.
One thing across this topic of change in the business and capturing the risks, I'm the regional head for a global organisation, so once a week I have to meet with my colleagues from France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Far East, South, LATAM, and we're developing some KRIs or some KPIs. Now I know metrics is a whole other topic that we could argue about for 2 hours, but one of the metrics that we're tracking is new products against security risk assessment. So once the architecture is stable for a new product, we have to make sure what we're calling the SRA, the security risk assessment, is done. And that needs to be kept at 100% and reported on every month. One of them is number of new products. If that number is not 0, number of SRAs must be the same as that number, or else you're not getting your priorities right. So that's one way we're using metrics to track that people are doing the risk assessments for changes that are coming down the pipeline.
Excellent. What about getting it earlier in the process?
Yeah, exactly. So we're working to that effect to try to get it earlier in the process, as far as going back to what I spoke to about having my directs embedded with the business teams. So this way, as we're starting to hear about the potential for new products or have the discussions of, then we can start discussing what are the higher level risks, because we have regulated products and non-regulated products. So this way, as you're starting to hear of what's on that product roadmap, we can at least start throwing out there that, okay, so if you're going to go with this type of product, you should be thinking about these 3 things and start addressing it as early on as possible.
Hello. Oh, there we go. All right, this is my favorite picture. I love this guy. So this is a really thorny question, isn't it? Isn't it come up every year? And yet I really wanted to include it as one of the points. How we manage to demonstrate the return on investment for information security. And this is a risk question, I think, because without budget we don't get to do stuff, and we certainly don't get to do mitigation. Thom, can I ask you to weigh in on this?
So I would look at this from a slightly sort of a higher perspective in 2 ways. One, we view information security as a differentiator. It's something that will differentiate us, our agencies, our group from our competitors. Come and do your risky work with us. Come and give us your crown jewels of your business. We will look after them. And if that is very much a security element to the business that we get in. With higher risks, you get greater reward. The other thing I would say as well is, unless you actually know what it is that your business does, there's no way at all you'll be able to prove return on investment. So I would suggest, anybody who has not read the company report does not know what the business does. Anybody who's not actually gone down onto the shop floor or into the studio or talked to the business or they might do show and tells about the work, or whatever it is. If you haven't done any of that and you've just sat in your ivory office tower, whatever you like to call it, and just basically dictated about what information security should do, you are actually limiting the business's capability to get a return on investment on you. You're the department of no. In my industry, there's a guy called Steve Mora, who's the head of digital marketing for Miller Coors, the brewery company. And his quote is, "This is what I need digital to do to help me sell more beer." So if you swap out digital and put security in there, you need to be able to answer that, or you need to be able to state that. This is what I need security to do to help me sell more beer, or whatever it is that you do. If you cannot, in such a simple statement as that, if you cannot relate that to what you do for your business, you can't even begin to give an example, prove that you're creating a return on investment for your business.
James.
Question for the audience. I know there was no audience participation warning with this panel, but if we could have a quick show of hands for those who've had to produce a business case for putting a security solution in, whether it's DLP, new firewall upgrade. Now, if you keep your hands up, if someone came back and checked that the business case checked out, whether internal audit or the finance team came back and checked whether you delivered the business case, is that 10% of the hands that went up?
Yeah.
So the point I wanted to make is not that many people are interested in the work you've done, but some are, because 10% had their business case checked after delivery.
And don't the other 90% just come across as really trustworthy people?
That's how you get on in security.
Or the fact that you're offering evidence of that return on investment anyway. So it depends on the relationship. If it's very much take the money and go away and keep quiet for a little while and just give me a thumbs up every now and then when we pass in the corridor, then that's a very different situation. If there is genuine interest, then yeah, I agree. It should either be volunteered and evidenced, or there should be that formal cycle. But I think it's not quite as black and white, but I do understand what you're saying.
And there are lots of different ways to do your calculation. I know you could debate that for a couple of hours. But I found a paper from the Australian government that has 4 or 5 laid out as to different approaches and how you might use them. So it'd be worth looking into.
We created our own.
You created your own.
Of course we do it better than everybody else.
Google is your friend.
Exactly.
Let's keep going. Come on.
Yeah, I'd say the other component of that is I do like the idea of going back and checking, obviously, that the solution was implemented. But from my point of view, it's, when don't we come around and ask for more money? But again, it's usually the question I'm concerned with, well, you just got X amount of money, are we good now? And then say, well, define good, and define for how long. So it's really, the bigger challenge for me is, as we're continuing to increase our investments, or as the outside, threat environment changes, that changes our investment as well. And it's a matter of, it's much harder to say, I'm getting this amount of return, from spending $500,000 on increased pen testing or things like that. So I'd say that's a challenge as we expand our programs to cover the additional products, but there's no, I guess, consistent way of measuring, okay, we're getting X amount of value and we're testing X amount of applications that I can easily measure, but now it's, I need to work on develop that into a finer kind of metric of how we measure the return of maybe, the value of things caught early versus the value of fixing it late.
I think in some areas it's a lot easier than others. So a good example would be DDoS protection here. So you can, John Lewis, we're a big online retailer. We are looking at DDoS protection. That's going to cost X. How much would it cost us if on our Black Friday we had our website down for 4 hours? We know how many sales we take in, so we can do some rough calculation and go, if we spend $500,000 on DDoS protection, and 4 hours of Black Friday down, that's £12 million lost. Therefore, that's an easy thing to put forward in front of the board. But it's a bit like insurance. You're going to pay a lot of money that you may never get any use from as well, so you never know. So I think you can go to a number of vendors, and every vendor at this show today will be able to give you their proprietary tool that shows you the return on investment for whatever piece of software or hardware you want to buy, and each one will be different. But I think this talks back to sort of risks and incidents as well. So if you can demonstrate you've spent £100,000 on something and the number of incidents related to whatever it was you invested in has decreased, that's a really good way of coming back to management and going, look, we haven't generated any sales out of it directly, but we have reduced the number of incidents, which means help desk calls have gone down. We spent less time dealing with that, and the branch has been able to get on and sell, which is what the business want.
That's metrics again, isn't it? And I think those are inextricably linked issues, clearly. See what the magic conveyor belt brings us next. Oh, yes. Demonstrating tangible risk reduction whilst balancing that with long-term strategic aims. Now, that's an interesting question. I had to bring in Mordock, the preventer of information services there. He is officially licensed to appear here today, don't worry, in case you're an agent for Scott Adams. But, can I start with David on this one?
Yeah, sure. I'd say that's definitely an ongoing challenge as far as how do we demonstrate the long-term value. I think the DDoS solution was a good example of that. But the other things, as far as one of the things we continually invest in our people for the training and awareness. But I'm pretty well convinced after a number of years of doing that has a certain shelf life, that it stays in people's head for 2 weeks, and then after that it's just gone. So I'd say it's the combination of things of how you put together that whole effective program to look at how do you reduce, get some strategic wins over a longer period of time.
Is this a more challenging set of requirements than the average senior security professional is used to dealing with? Are we getting up to the level where we can actually do this, think tactically and strategically, and deliver properly supported cases using decent metrics?
I've got a different take on this question.
Okay.
And that would be, again, when you're dealing with the risk department more, dealing with audit committees more, and going back to designing a risk management framework that works for you. If shop being online availability is high up on the corporate side of risk register, then you might score impact and likelihood for your risk management framework, whatever numbers you choose for your organization. But the likelihood is the side of that equation that you could tackle with investment in a security solution. So if you'd scored it on a 5x5 as 16, 4x4, and you've said that the likelihood has come down to 2 or 1, then you can draw red dots and green dots or amber dots as a before mitigation and after mitigation in a presentation to your CRO and your CFO, and that they will get.
Especially if it's only 2 slides, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. All the cyber-related risks in the universe need to be compressed to 2 slides. Yeah. A chart and an explanation of the chart. Yeah.
Yeah, and for us, I think building on that, we kind of focused on, I guess, breaking up sections of the portfolio based on their riskiness to kind of figure out how we're going to drive risk down on the longer term. Because again, I think it's easier to show by, in our case, which portfolio is riskier and what steps that we can take to drive it down, and we've had good success with that, rather than I want to implement this solution across the whole organization and maybe blanket.
And this is something that, this is my bullet point, because this is something I'm facing on a daily basis. So we have a long-term security improvement program within John Lewis, which is stretching over the next 3 to 4 years. So that's what we want to do. We have a number of projects within that, which is going to improve our security posture, lead to long-term risk reduction, and help the business understand it better. But at the same time, I have the audit and risk committees going, these audit points need to be closed, which is tactical, short-term solutions. Our risk is coming down, we're closing open audit points. So it's like, okay, we're going to do 6 or 7 months work, we're going to build an identity and access management solution, a proper asset management database. But at the same time, I've got to go, right, we've got to put something in the next 3 weeks to close off an open P1 audit point as well. And I find that's difficult, is having that balance of the operational security side of things to close that off. What are we going to do to reduce the number of help desk calls relating to password resets, because it's an open P1, as opposed to what we want is a proper identity management solution across the organization, which over the long term is going to remove that as an obstacle.
I would say that you can't demonstrate anything tangible unless you know what your baseline is, and very often, baselining is one of the things that, as an industry, we've not done very well at, be it education awareness or risk management or whatever. So I think, if you're struggling to demonstrate tangible risk reduction, do you actually know where you're reducing from? And if you don't, then try and work that out first of all, and then you'll have a much better chance of working this out.
You need a way to measure it, which brings us back to the metrics discussion.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's a really good point, because I've been at, witnessed a presentation and indeed seen a quarterly report from an operational security team that didn't know what to put in there really, and just basically put the number of viruses that had been trapped at the network perimeter, which is like very exciting and makes it look like a jolly good idea to have some form of perimeter defense. But it wasn't actually thought through in the slightest amount as a strategic objective to help the business be more secure and to trade faster and better.
We don't know if the numbers are good or bad. 7, fantastic.
Yeah. 35,000.
I mean, that goes back to your earlier statement too, of I think the key thing was, there's a difference between operational metrics that maybe we use lower in our organization to drive, day-to-day security operations versus, how do you boil them up to be the right strategic type of
the higher up in the organization, the fewer words and the more primary colors you need in your slides.
Absolutely. Yeah. Red, amber, green is just perfect. Could get rid of the amber, that would be even better.
Well, I disagree with that, but that's a whole other talk.
All right, what else we got? Oh, yeah, okay. So this, I thought, would promote the best and more prolonged element of discussion. And there's several points hidden behind this, because I tried to reduce it to as few words as possible and just a couple of primary colors. But talking about communicating and marketing risk from a cyber mindset to a board of directors that may in some cases have a good understanding of commercial risk, and in other cases not so much. Possibly an audit committee that's involved tangentially as well, and NEDs who are involved in the audit committee as well. How do we communicate effectively about these issues, and how do we also educate them to realize that just because it's IT, we can't make the risk zero?
You make any risk zero. I mean, I guess you could avoid it.
I think there's an implicit thinking about IT, that it's kind of digital. But
this is the point, isn't it? Risk is not a dirty word. Risk is something that keeps businesses innovating and doing work and stretching themselves and earning money, etc. If your business stops taking risk, be it in security or IT or law or HR or whatever, the business stagnates. So I think that's the key to this is understanding that risk is not a bad thing. Not understanding risk is a bad thing. And so the communication and marketing is making sure that you understand how your business handles risk, right back to the very first point. What is their attitude towards risk? How do they want to take it? So just because you've got a high, bright red risk doesn't mean that you have to deal with it. You can accept it. That may be a perfectly acceptable thing. It's a high-risk strategy for a business to do, which they do all the time.
Yeah.
It's not our job to be a moral conscience of the business. It's our job to merely say, this is what it is.
That's a super point, because I think of all the industries that exist, information security carries the largest risk of being preachers and moralists in functioning in amoral business work. What do you think?
Along similar lines, if you think of information security managers and management and senior people in that discipline, you should really be like auditors, the conduit of the message.
Right.
Yeah. People who are closer to their operations, whether that's project managers putting a new solution in or service delivery managers managing a solution that's already in, might own the day-to-day. Or if you've got NOCs and SOCs and certs, you might have SecOps being done at a mature level. But the actual information security management and measuring against an information security management system or management framework, which is what senior management in this sort of event should be doing. We are like auditors, we just bring the messages of what's working and what's not, and we're normally bringing the messages of what's not working. There's very little to shout about what's going really well. So that's one thing that I would say on from what Thom was saying. Picking out some of the words in your slides. Marketing your security function, wherever you sit in the organization, horizontally and vertically, but getting into bed with internal communications, your senior management, people from seniors in HR, seniors in legal, stopping at the water cooler with the head of legal. If data governance and data protection doesn't sit with you, build some bridges with them. That kind of communication and marketing, so that outside of normal security awareness programs, people know you are the person with the answers, but not the person to blame. And people know that outside of IT is what comes from from marketing your division, your team, whatever. Not marketing yourself, but marketing what you're doing inside the organization will help your relationships with the risk department and with the SecOps.
Yeah, it makes complete sense. Do you think people are actually doing this, or are we still living in that ivory office or whatever it was earlier?
So I think some of it is getting the right message to the right people. It's more than just having the security engineers or the AppSec guys talk to the developers. I think it's more of, how are you distilling that message upward also, just to make sure that the security message isn't just stopping with the developers or the engineering teams. It's making sure that you're having the right level of communications all the way through the management chain.
And is that opportunity there, at a board meeting? Is there a channel to do that?
I'd say we're seeing that opportunity more and more now. It's also making sure, too, that the teams are, know how to have the right level of conversation as well. I think the environment is there now. If anything, there's more willingness than ever from boards and senior management to understand it. It's just, are you conveying it in the right manner? And can you demonstrate a good understanding of the business, what we covered earlier? Because if you can't relay it in a way or demonstrate that you understand the business strategy, it's not going to work.
This is a superset of that old chestnut learning how to speak business speak, because that's not really the issue, is it? Some key words will be important, but it's the concepts behind them that is really what used to be absent so often in people who'd grown from a technical role and who maybe really hadn't read the annual report.
So within John Lewis, I think we're quite fortunate in that our marketing of security and the importance of security has worked quite well. So now I don't need to ask to go to the board meetings or to go to senior management meetings within the different divisions. I don't have to go and say, look, can I come and talk to you? They come and ask me to come and talk to them as well, which is really important. I think once the business come and ask you to attend the business meetings, you know you've got your message across and they're starting to understand the priorities. Especially when you get the backing, and I think somebody mentioned earlier, when you've got somebody like the CFO who understands, they generally own the risks within most organizations, so they tend to own the overall risk. Once they understand that, and they're able to help you with your marketing, your communication of how important it is, that gets a lot of buy-in from the rest of the business. There's a financial arm to this as well, therefore, it's going to cost us money, therefore this is important.
Yeah. Is the nature of John Lewis Partnership as a partnership helpful and supportive of that?
Yes and no, I think is the answer. So yes, it is in terms of everyone understands that everything they do contributes to the partnership as a whole. But at the same time, we're a partner, we're a trust organisation. Of course, we're doing all that already. So you're balancing the two there. But I think generally it is a good thing.
Probably, yes. Okay. I'd forgotten this one got stuck in. I did this at the last minute from an input from one of you. I can't remember who. I really like this slide, of course, because I get really frustrated by the old standard. If you don't know FUD, it's fear, uncertainty, and doubt. It was a standard IBM sales technique in the 80s. Not to name names or anything. So this was a well-made point. There was at least a huge period of taking those headline stories and using them like a crowbar on the board or on senior management. So, have we got it right now? Can we balance that, using it where we need to, but actually building a more balanced approach around risk rather than fear and panic and so on?
I think we do. I think the board are often coming to us now, shaking the newspaper and saying, is this going to happen to us? Because they're understanding the business implications. They're seeing their buddies at the golf club. They're seeing their business is being hit and targeted, and the consequences of that. And so I think it's using stuff that's actually happening in the real world is one of the better ways of effective communication of what the real risks are, not the FUD side of things. But I think it's one of those key questions that the board should ask every time, which is how secure are we, and is this going to happen to us? And if you can answer those questions with all of that ocean of data at the bottom, if you can answer those things, I think this is a great example of how to do it.
I think people in this room should learn how to question the numbers. If something says 97% of our survey needed this, or 13% of people don't do this, or question the numbers. And it's quite an old text, but a very clever text. I think it's How to Lie with Statistics by Huff from 1954. And it basically talks about all the different biases marketing companies can put in that ends up in the marketing collateral. And there was a very interesting Black Hat talk about this translating that into research bias. So research bias and marketing bias question the numbers, because both of those overlap in the marketing collateral when people are selling you security solutions. So I think anyone who has an interest in A-level maths and statistics should look into where these numbers come from and what they really mean. Now, some solution providers and channel partners and things will work really hard on your return on investment calculations and whether you really need something. But yeah, learn to lift the cover on the numbers is one of the things. And the kind of marketing that is, you've been owned and we're the best people to show you how. Don't be scared of that anymore. But data breaches in similar organisations, or even if you're not prepared to talk about it in your organisations, can open the checkbooks. That's the other side of this point.
I mean, I think in 60% of those reports that you mentioned, they're right every time. No doubt.
Yes, that's classic.
You slipped that in sweetly, aren't you?
I definitely agree. I'd say the time for FUD is long past, and it's about having meaningful conversations. And the newspapers do enough job of publishing who the latest breach was or who the latest incident was.
Brings a whole new definition to are we a target, doesn't it? Yeah.
And I think especially if an organisation in your market sector is subject to a data breach, so whether it may be in retail or if all of a sudden the board will sit up and ask questions, one of our competitors has a data breach, their question will be, are we next? Probably behind the, thank goodness it was them, at the same time. One of the first questions I got asked in my first week in the organisation by my CFO was, are we going to fall victim to the same thing Sony were victim to? That was the opening question. My first day I met her, hello, my name is so-and-so. That was the opening question. So can't really give you an answer today, but and so that's the fear and loathing bit that comes out of the marketing. I think one of the quotes I do like is, there are two types of organisations. There's those who've had a data breach and those that don't know they've had a data breach. And I think that's quite important because then that gets people thinking, okay, we might not have had one, but there's a good chance that if we don't do anything about it, we are going to be the victim of one. And it does, as you mentioned, it does prompt people to spend some money. I wouldn't want to, say, have a data breach to get your business case approved, but it certainly helps.
But you can definitely have meaningful conversations out of that stuff. I think from the point of view of when you get asked that question of are we the next Sony or things like that, I think the meaningful conversation underlying it is maybe you can distill out the components of business. So maybe, okay, so we have PCI like they do, we have this like they do. So maybe if you take a look at the PCI section, okay, we're good. We've tested that area. What are we doing in this? So you can maybe distill out the relevant parts from what that exposure was and speak to the facts of, okay, maybe how mature are we as an organization within that component, rather than just have the vague, are we next?
Yeah. The problem with that approach, of course, going back to your point about, it does get budget, but it gets budget for the replacement of you. Once you've been fired, especially CISO does stand for career is so over.
Okay, so my timing works sweetly. This is attempting to summarise onto one slide everything that we've spoken about today. While you're digesting that, I'm going to ask my colleagues here to give me just one quick summary of what they'd like you to take away from their perspective. I'm going to start with Thom.
Very simply, I think just help your business sell more beer.
James.
Get good at those really, really, really digested consent presentations with just a red and a green dot on. Get very good at those, but always base it on fact. Do not do too much exaggeration as you go up the organisation.
And I would just add, have meaningful conversations about how that security risk relates to a true business risk. This way it makes it real for the organization.
I would say get security involved at the beginning of anything your organization wants to do. So right at the idea stage, if somebody's got an idea for a new product, a new business innovation, ask security right at the beginning. It might be we can then go, we don't have any involvement in that, go ahead and do it, or you really need to take this on board. And the earlier you do it, the easier it is to get that through.
Terrific. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your wisdom and your contribution today. I'm sure you all would join me in thanking our panel for presenting some really interesting points around this topic. Thank you.